Hello little legends, welcome to another video. This one's on tax and welfare reform policies. On the surface pretty straightforward, but just want to take you through a few key elements to make sure you're successful in answering questions in relation to this key knowledge point. Alright, so welfare reform. We're going to start with welfare reform. This is one out of the two that most students tend to trip up on, so be really mindful of that. When we talk about welfare reform policies, it's really easy to talk about how the government's giving money to welfare, therefore people are spending money, and you go down the aggregate demand pathway. So, burp, 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 burp. Warning, no, this is in the aggregate supply section of the study design. Now, when you're doing your SAC, that's going to be pretty straightforward because all the questions are going to require you to talk about aggregate supply stuff. But in the exam, it can be really tricky, and you've just got to make sure that whenever you see welfare reform policies, you keep your aggregate supply hat firmly on and go down an aggregate supply pathway. And on the screen here, these are the things that you're going to see or going to talk about in regards to welfare reform policies. These are policies that are designed to reduce welfare dependency. That just means if people are dependent, they rely on something. So reduce the amount of people who rely on welfare, and also to improve labour market conditions, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, because there's lots of different welfare reform policies that we're going to go through. One thing I want to be mindful of is that word reform in the study design really means they're talking about big projects here. So not so much little ones that pop up in the budget from time to time. This is for something to be reformed. It's got to be a significant, long-lasting change. Okay, so looking at the study design up the top there, it says how welfare and tax reform policies are designed to 1. Influence aggregate supply, and 2. Living standards. So you do not need to link to the goals with welfare reform policies. It's just AS and living standards, so a little bit simpler. Alright, so that's the definition. Policies designed to reduce welfare dependency and improve labour market conditions. Here we go. So we're going to go the same pathways as we went with the budgetary policies designed to influence aggregate supply along ability and willingness. And you can argue either here. Now, in the exam or the SAC, you may be given a welfare reform policy specifically. You may have to bring in a welfare reform policy specifically, or you might be asked generally, how do welfare reform policies influence aggregate supply and living standards? So you need to be prepared for all three eventualities. So on ability to supply, how this works is, well, if people are encouraged to enter the labour force, then there are more workers in the labour force, and that's going to lift productive capacity. And that's that key idea of how we're going to link to ability to supply in this particular context. If the overall ability to supply in an economy increases, we can make more stuff. Think of it as the AS line is shifting, or the PPF line is shifting out as well, or we're moving closer towards the PPF line. All those things are going to increase the amount of stuff that we can possibly make, which is obviously aggregate supply. Alternatively, you can go down the willingness pathway, where if you have more workers that have entered the labour force, that's going to increase the supply of labour, and it's going to put downward pressure on wages, just the basic law of supply. So that's going to result in a fall in the cost of production, with both of those resulting in an increase to aggregate supply. Okay, so either of those pathways is fine. There are a number of welfare reform policies that are in the textbook that you can use as examples of things that do both the ability and willingness to supply here, that you can refer to as examples here, and that will be updated with every year. One that just comes top of mind is the tightening of the criteria to receive welfare. Is one that will increase the ability to supply, because people who were getting, say, disability support pensions before and now are not getting disability support pensions because the criteria has changed will now have to enter the labour force, thereby increasing productive capacity and increasing aggregate supply. Okay. Another one for willingness might be people who are on unemployment benefits are getting less penalised for picking up small pieces of part-time work. Okay, before any hour that you worked or any dollar that you earned came off the money that you earned in welfare benefits, And so there was not an incentive to actually participate in the labour force. Those rules have somewhat relaxed, and so therefore there are more people who have entered the labour force, increasing the supply of labour and putting downward pressure on wages. More detail for that, check out your textbook materials. Now we've got a link to living standards. This is really straightforward, guys, because this is exactly the same pathway that we've always been doing after we get from a starting point of an increase in aggregate supply. So when aggregate supply increases, total production increases, resulting in higher incomes. And then that's a really nice, easy link then to an increase in access to goods and services and material living standards. So there's not really much new here. If you get a question on welfare reform policies linking both to aggregate supply and living standards, the living standards mark will often just be an extra mark, so an extra 1 mark. And so you can do this relatively straightforward process to get that extra mark. All right, moving forward to tax reform. So here we're talking the tax system. Again, be really mindful here not to link it through to changes to the aggregate demand equation. So in the exam specifically, be really careful when you see the word tax to say, okay, is this talking about an aggregate demand tax change, such as a change to income tax? Or is this talking about a tax reform policy, something that's a broader wholesale change that's going to affect or encourage one of these 3 things in the economy? If it's something that could be both, and it can be both, the question will dictate for you by saying something like on the supply side of the economy or on the demand side of the economy. So what is taxation reform policies? They are designed to encourage 3 things. Entrepreneurial behaviour, if you can say that, which is closely linked to innovation, but essentially they are policies designed to encourage businesses to try new things. And then the last one there is investment in capital. So financial incentives for businesses to invest in extension of factories, new technology, so on and so forth. So that's a definition that I just went through. We're going to go the same pathways here. So ability to supply, how this one works if you want to go down this pathway, is incentives to invest in capital and research. They develop new and efficient methods of production, increasing productive capacity. So you'll see on ability to supply here, we're using that same language of productive capacity in order to link to ability to supply. What this essentially means is due to the incentives provided to businesses to invest, we find new ways to make stuff, which we couldn't make before. And as a result, we can make more stuff, hence the ability to supply increasing. And on the willingness side, this is the real straightforward one. It's just financial incentives to lower the cost of production. So government says, all right, I want you to invest money in this particular area. We're going to give some money off your tax bill. It's really just as simple as that. Both of those obviously increase aggregate supply because we've got a change in ability or willingness to supply. The pathway to get to living standards for this is exactly the same. All right, so you'll see here aggregate supply increases. What comes next? You're right, total production increases resulting in higher incomes. What comes next? Yes, you're right, access to goods and services increase, and then the final thing is obviously you're going to answer the question, and in this case it's increase in material living standards. So it was a nice short video on these 2 particular aggregate supply policies. Relatively straightforward once you get started. The key thing with these questions are just be really mindful to link through to the ability or willingness really clearly, and make sure in the exam, if it's an aggregate supply question, you answer with an aggregate supply pathway. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.